In the early hours of March 9, 1943, somewhere deep in the cold expanse of the North Atlantic, the German submarine U-223 moved like a shadow beneath the waves. The sea above was calm and naturally calm, yet every man aboard knew the truth. In the Battle of the Atlantic, stillness meant nothing. Danger could come from any direction, at an seconde. And on that night, in that stretch of unforgiving water, one of the most advanced technologies of the entire Second World War quietly came to life. It wasn't a weapon, it wasn't a torpedo. It was something far more revolutionary, der Gruppenhorchegger, known simply as GHG, Germany's passive sonar system. The submarine's sound operator, Oberfunkmat Heinz Behrens, stiffened a moment. A faint vibration ran through his headphones. It was a pattern he recognized. The rhythmic churn of a Royal Navy destroyer's but something felt different tonight. The ocean seemed louder, sharp, almost magnified. Heinz wasn't imagining things. The U-223 had recently been fitted with an upgraded GHG array, 24 hydrophones installed along the bow, capable of detecting ships up to 20 kilometers away, long before Allied technology could do anything comparable. Historians would later call it the ears of the deep, a device decades ahead of its time. The submarine's commanding officer, Captain Lieutenant Karl-Georg Wächter, stepped toward the listening station. He understood the stakes. The Allies were now deploying the early form of active sonar system that could reveal a submarine's position with terrifying accuracy. One mistake, one wrong turn, and the U-23 could be hunted, cornered, and blown apart by depth charges. But with the GHG, Wächter held a rare advantage. He could see the ocean without revealing his presence. He leaned closer. "Direction?" he asked quietly. Heinz adjusted the dials, focusing. "Sector 3, sir." Closing in. With that, Wächter ordered a silent, evasive dive. No shouting, no quick movements, only the hum of electric motors and the sound of 46 men trying not to breathe too loudly. The pressure increased as the U-223 dropped deeper and deeper, and the steel hull risked buckling. Yet in that crushing darkness, the GHG fed back more information. The operator heard the destroyer's propellers shift rhythm. It was turning, but not toward them. Wächter had tricked it. The destroyer was searching in the wrong place entirely. This was the truth Hollywood rarely showed. U-boats were not crude death traps, stumbling blindly through the ocean. They were floating laboratories, equipped with experimental sensors, acoustic decoys, early radar detectors, anti-sonar coatings, and technologies that wouldn't become common on Allied submarines until after the war. To the men aboard these vessels, the GHG felt almost futuristic. Wächter studied the readings. The destroyer was now speeding away, convinced it had found a trail. The U-223 remained perfectly still, hidden beneath layers of darkness and silence. And in that moment, Germany's acoustic edge proved decisive. One submarine with its crew exhausted, freezing, and terrified managed to outmaneuver an entire escort force using nothing but a cluster of hydrophones wired into a system most of the world didn't even know existed. As the destroyer faded into the distance, Heinz removed his headphones slowly, his hands shaking with adrenaline. Wächter said nothing, but the men around him understood what had just happened. That night, deep below the Atlantic, the ocean didn't just sound different. It sounded alive, and the U-223 was listening. The morning after the U-223's narrow escape, the atmosphere inside the submarine felt different. Not lighter U-boats. Never felt light but sharper. As if every man aboard had suddenly become aware that their survival depended on more than instinct and discipline. It depended on technology most of them didn't fully understand. In the cramped command room, where pipes dripped condensation like a clock counting down the hours, Captain Lieutenant Karl-Georg Wächter met with the man responsible for keeping that technology alive, Leitender Ingenieur Otto Brandt, the chief engineer. Brandt was a veteran of the submarine service, but unlike most officers, his background wasn't purely naval. Before the war, he had worked for AEG, one of the companies secretly developing acoustic devices for the Kriegs. He knew the GHG system better than anyone aboard, and Wächter trusted him in a way commanders rarely trusted engineers. That morning, Brandt placed his hand on the cold steel casing of the GHG relay unit and exhaled slowly. "We pushed the system hard last night," he said. "Any harder and the amplification grid could have burned out WWII." Couture nodded. He knew the truth. The GHG gave them an edge. But it was fragile, temperamental. A lifeline that could snap without warning. While Brandt inspected the wiring, the crew gathered in small groups, whispering. They all understood what they had witnessed hours before. The GHG hadn't just detected a destroyer, it had mapped its movement, predicted its turn, and allowed the U-223 to slip through a gap that no one else could have exploited. But there was something else on the men's minds. The new rumors spreading through the fleet. Word had reached them that some U-boats were now being equipped with BEV, an early sound-absorbing rubber coating designed to make submarines harder to detect by active sonar. If true, it meant the ocean was becoming a battlefield where silence itself was a weapon. In the forward torpedo room, Matrosenka freighter Lucas Hartmann, one of the youngest sailors aboard, listened as the older crewmen debated the technology. Some believed the Allies had developed a device capable of hearing through steel. Others whispered that British scientists were experimenting with something called the Hedgehog, a forward-firing anti-submarine weapon that didn't rely on sonar at all. Hartmann kept quiet, but his thoughts drifted back to the night before. He remembered the way the submarine vibrated as they descended, the ominous groan of metal under pressure, and the sudden silence when the destroyer passed overhead. He had never felt the ocean so close, so alive, so capable of crushing them without warning. Back in the control room, Wächter studied the navigation charts. Their mission wasn't simply survival. They had been ordered to shadow a convoy route used by Allied merchant ships, relaying information to the U-boat command. But radio transmission was now a deadly gamble. The Allies had begun using HFDF, a high-frequency direction-finding system that could pinpoint German signals within minutes. One message could give away their position. One slip could doom them. Wächter tapped the chart softly, thinking. The GHG could help them track the convoy without transmitting if the system held. Brandt approached him again, wiping grease from his fingers. "The GHG is stable," he said, "but we shouldn't rely on it alone. It's powerful, yes, but it makes us bold. Boldness sinks boats." Wächter didn't disagree. Throughout the war, the German Navy had learned a cruel lesson. Technology helped, but the ocean punished arrogance. As the U-223 adjusted course, descending deeper into the cold blue void, Wächter looked at his crew, exhausted, hungry, but determined. None of them knew what awaited them on this patrol. But they knew one thing with absolute certainty. Their greatest strength was not their torpedoes, not their training, not even their courage. It was their ability to listen. By the time the U-223 reached the edge of the North Atlantic convoy route, the world above had disappeared beneath a dense wall of fog. It was the kind sailors feared the most. Not the violent storm, not the icy swell, but the quiet, suffocating fog that erased every point of reference. To TIs, it made escort work nearly impossible. To a German U-boat, it created an opportunity. And yet, as the submarine glided silently beneath the gray veil, Captain Lieutenant Kalja Wächter knew the fog had a double edge. It hid them, yes, but it hid everything else as well. Inside the control room, the tension felt almost sacred. The GHG hydrophones were now the crew's only eyes, and every man knew it. Oberfunkmatt, Einsbergen's headphones pressed tight against his skull, leaned forward as faint pulses echoed through the system. The fog distorted sound, bending and stretching it. What should have been a clear pattern became a maze of overlapping tones, merchant ships, escort vessels, descent machinery, all bleeding into one another. "Something's out there," Heinz said softly. "Multiple somethings. But the fog is playing tricks. I can't get distance yet." Wächter studied his operator's expression before turning to Leitendor engineer Otto Brandt, who was checking the amplification grid. Brandt gave a single nod. The system was holding barely, but holding. The captain returned to Heinz. "Steady. Filter the low frequencies first. Merchant ships drag their propellers differently." Heinz complied, adjusting the dials with the delicacy of a surgeon. Slowly, The chaos of sound began to resolve into recognizable patterns. The fog might distort the world above, but underwater, patterns still existed. Then Heinz heard a steady, powerful thrum that cut through the noise like a heartbeat through silence. "Convoy," he whispered. "Big one!" The men in the control room stopped moving. For a U-boat crew, a convoy meant two things: opportunity and danger. Where there were merchant ships, there were escorts. And where there were escorts, there were depth charges. The captain ordered the U-223 to hold depth and speed. "No rush," he said. "The ocean gives us time. We listen." It was a philosophy shared among the best U-boat commanders. Do not chase the convoy, let the convoy reveal itself, and the more they listened, the more the ocean spoke. Heinz suddenly stiffened, destroyer port side. Fast. Wächter's expression hardened. This was no wandering escort. This one was hunting. In the forward compartment, Matrosengefreiter Lukas Hartmann felt the shift in the submarine's posture. Even without hearing the orders, he sensed danger creeping in. The air was thicker now, the silence heavier. He wiped sweat from his brow and murmured a quiet prayer, something he had done since the first patrol. Around him, the older sailors checked equipment with motions so practiced they could have been sleepwalking. Back in the control room, the GHG picked up something new, a faint, rhythmic clicking. Brandt leaned in. "Ostic sweeps," he warned. "Active sonar." The destroyer was probing the ocean like a blind giant tapping the walls of a dark cave. If the sonar pulse bounced back off the U-223's hull, the destroyer would know exactly where they were. Wächter weighed his options. Surfacing was impossible. Diving deeper risked structural failure. Turning away would produce noise. The only solution was the most dangerous. Remain perfectly still and trust the GHG to guide them between the sweeps. For a full minute, no one aboard the U-223 breathed normally. The destroyer passed overhead, Aztec pulses slashing through the water like invisible blades. Each one shook the men's nerves. Each one came closer than the last. And yet, none returned an unmistakable echo. The GHG picked up the destroyer's engines receding. Slowly at first, then faster. They had slipped through. The convoy was close the men could feel its vibrations in the steel around them. And for the U-223, the hunt was only just beginning. Hours after evading the destroyer's Aztec sweeps, the U-223 approached the convoy's flank like a predator stalking the edge of a migrating herd. The fog above had thickened into a solid blanket, the kind that swallowed light and sound alike. For Capet, Lieutenant Kaljer Wächter, this was both a gift and a burden. Fog distorted enemy lookouts, but it also forced him to rely almost entirely on instruments, primarily the GHG hydrophones and the newly installed FUMB Metox radar detector, designed to alert U-boats to Allied air search radar. In 1943, technology was no longer an accessory to submarine warfare. It was the battlefield itself. As the U-223 rose to periscope depth, the steel hull groaned softly, adjusting to the pressure differences. Wächter stood ready at the attack periscope, one hand steadying himself against the vibration of the motors. "Up periscope," he ordered quietly. The narrow tube rose through the water column, cutting a path toward the fog-layered surface. When the lens finally broke through, vision was poor, blurry, muted, distorted by droplets and haze, and yet Wächter's pulse quickened. Through the milky gray, shapes were emerging. "Merchant port side," he muttered. "Large silhouette, probably a tanker." Tankers were prime targets, the lifeblood of Allied logistics, but Wächter didn't allow excitement to cloud judgment. Tankers were heavily guarded. He scanned slowly, methodically, like a surgeon examining an open wound. The fog shifted, just enough for him to catch the outline of something sharp, or a warship. Its bow knifed clean through the water. "Escort vessel," he said, "likely a Flower-class corvette. Small, but deadly, armed with sonar, depth charges, and a crew trained ruthlessly for anti-submarine warfare." In the control room below, Oberfunkmat Heinz Behrens listened intently as the GHG confirmed what the periscope could only hint at. multiple screws turning at different frequencies. Merchant ships and various and two escorts, one close, one distant. The convoy was shielded, and slipping in unnoticed would take precision bordering on perfection. At his station, late in der Ingeniu Otto, Brandt monitored the Mitox-Detector. Any spike in frequency could signal Allied radar picking them up from the fog-shrouded sky above. Brandt muttered to himself, adjusting dials. The British have new airborne sets. They'll find us before we see them, if we're not careful. Wächter lowered the periscope. The crew watched him. They trusted his instincts, but they also knew the statistics. By 1943, U-boat losses had surged to catastrophic levels. Every attack risked becoming a death sentence. Yet Wächter's expression held no hesitation-only calculation. This convoy is heading toward the gap between Greenland and Iceland, he said. Escorts are stretched thin there. If we strike it, must be before they reach reinforced waters. He walked toward the chart table, tapping a sector lightly. We follow submerged, silent running. The order rippled through the submarine. Electric motors hummed softer. Crewmen took off boots to move silently. Tools were secured. Whispering ceased. To avoid sonar detection, the U-223 reduced speed to 2 knots. The submarine glided forward like a drifting shadow. Every noise mattered. Even a dropped wrench could mean death. As they closed in, the vibrations of the convoy grew stronger, felt, not just in the headphones, but in the steel itself. The U-223 was no longer approaching the convoy. It was among it, moving beneath the merchant fleet like a silent observer. Then Heinz stiffened. A new sound pulsed through the hydrophones, one he didn't recognize at first. Rhythmic, but sharp. Precise. Not a screw, not a pump, not a rudder. Brandt's face drained of color. "That's no escort," he whispered. "That's aircraft radar." Wächter closed his eyes for half a second. An aircraft above, hidden in the fog, sweeping the ocean. For submarines, the hunt had just become a race. One mistake now, and the ocean would swallow them whole. The fog had become their shield, but now it threatened to become their tomb. As soon as Leiter Ingenieur Otto Brandt recognized the spike on the Mitox detector, every man in the control room knew what it meant. An Allied aircraft was somewhere above the U-223, flying blind through the fog, yet searching with something far more dangerous than eyesight. The British and Canadians had begun outfitting long-range patrol bombers with ASV-Mk2 radar, a system that pierced through weather and darkness, turning fog from an obstacle into an advantage. And if the aircraft detected them, the submarine wouldn't stand a chance. "Capitan, the signal is unstable but strong," Brandt said, eyes fixed on the glowing meter. "It's sweeping wide arcs. They're looking for us." Wächter didn't hesitate. Dive. 50 meters. Silent running. The command echoed through the hull. The ballast tanks flooded with a thunderous rush, then went quiet. The submarine dropped beneath the fog, swallowed by cold water. The men gripped pipes, railings, bolts, anything that kept them steady as pressure wrapped around the hull. Every creak felt like a warning. Every vibration felt too loud. In the listening room, Oberfunkmott Heinz Behrens waited for the return of underwater calm. After a few seconds, the noise of the dive faded, and the world shrank back into that eerie, subaquatic stillness. Then Heinz heard a distant hum, unlike any convoy engine. Slow at first, then intensifying. "The rhythm of the sky, aircraft confirmed," he whispered. "Twin engine, probably a Hudson or Halifax patrol plane." Up above, hidden in the fog, like a ghost with wings, the aircraft flew low, dragging its radar beam across the ocean's surface. If the U-223 had remained at periscope depth, the radar might have spotted the periscope mast protruding through the fog. That tiny silhouette was all it took. But now, below 50 meters, they were invisible to radar. Invisible, but not safe. Wächter knew. The pilots weren't fools. Allied air crews had experience. They listened for U-boats. They watched for oil slicks. They followed intuition. And so the question was not whether the aircraft could detect them, but whether it would guess correctly. "Maintain course," WWII ordered. No turns unless necessary. Noise was the enemy. Now, a simple rudder correction could travel through the water like a shout. The submarine crept forward, the hull gliding silently through the murky blue darkness. Heinz strained to listen for any sign the aircraft had dipped. Sonar buoy some Allied planes had begun using early acoustic probes, but he heard nothing except the faint, fading hum of engines. Minutes passed, then more minutes. Finally, the hum began to drift away, muffled by distance and fog. Brandt checked the Metox detector again. The signal weakened, then flickered, then vanished entirely. A collective exhale filled the submarine, but relief was fragile. Just as Wächter prepared to issue new orders, Heinz's face changed. His eyes focused sharply on something new, something deeper, heavier, unmistakable. He began, swallowing hard. I'm picking up multiple screws. 3. No. 4 ships. Wächter leaned close. Distance. Farther coming toward us. Brandt stepped forward. Could be the main body of the convoy. Heinz shook his head. No, sir. Too organized. Too tight. And the signatures... He paused, listening again. Their escort vessels, all of them. Wächter understood instantly. The aircraft wasn't hunting them alone. It was herding them. The Allies were coordinating air and sea tactics using radar-equipped aircraft to push U-boats toward the waiting jaws of destroyers and corvettes. A new strategy. A deadly one. The U-223 wasn't stalking the convoy anymore. The convoy's guardians were stalking them. And for the first time since the patrol began, Wächter felt the cold truth settle into his bones. This mission was no longer about finding targets. It was about surviving the night. Night fell again over the North Atlantic. But for the men of the U-223, darkness no longer offered comfort. It felt tigged, as if the ocean itself had narrowed into a corridor with walls closing in from both sides. Hours after the aircraft vanished into the fog, the submarine now found itself drifting into the path of a formation of Allied escort vessels for ships whose only purpose was to hunt submarines. Destroyers and corvettes, armed with sonar, depth charges, and a growing understanding of U-boat tactics. The hunter had become the hunt. Inside the control room, the atmosphere was suffocating. Sweat clung to the men's collars, despite the cold. No one dared to shift their weight too much. Even the pipes seemed to creak more quietly. Capit and Lieutenant Wächter stood with one hand on the chart table, his eyes locked onto the navigation plot. He knew the truth. They couldn't outrun escorts. U-boats were slower underwater. The only hope was to listen harder, think faster, and move quieter than the men above. At the hydrophone station, Oberfunkmat Heinz Behrens monitored the escort's approach. Their propeller signatures were unmistakable, fast, coordinated, disciplined. He could tell their type, their distance, even their intent by the rhythm alone. 2 corvettes ahead, 1 destroyer approaching from starboard. 4th ship. Uncertain, he said. Possibly a trawler with sonar equipment. Wächter felt a sting of recognition. The British had converted civilian trawlers into anti-submarine vessels early in the war. Crude, but effective. Ranged, he asked. 6 kilometers. Closing, Heinz replied. Leitendor and Generator Brandt checked the pressure gauges as the U-223 descended to 80 meters. The steel hull groaned loudly, the noise echoing through the submarine like a warning. We're approaching the safe limit, Captain, he said. We can go deeper, but it'll be loud. Too loud. Noise meant death. Wächter considered the map. To the north was deeper water, but closer to the convoy's core. To the south, shallower boot, fewer escorts. The ocean had become a chessboard, and he was forced to move his king into danger no matter which direction he chose. Maintain depth, he said. Silent running. Engines had 1 knot. The submarine slowed to a near drift, slipping through the water like a falling leaf. Every man aboard adjusted his breathing instinctively, inhaling only when necessary. Even a cough could reverberate. Heinz stiffened suddenly. A ese, de, ese ping. A sharp metallic pulse vibrated through the water. Then another. And another. The escorts were sweeping aggressively. The pings grew louder, closer, then fainter, then louder again. They were triangulating. Brant whispered, "They know we're here." Another series of sharp pings struck the hull. The submarine trembled. The men looked at each other, though no one spoke. On the surface, the escorts were forming a tightening circle. Then came the unmistakable sound, faint at first, then multiplying of depth charge racks being prepared. Heinz said, barely audible, "They're setting patterns. Depth charges, the deadliest weapon ever created for trapped They didn't need to hit the boat. They only had to detonate nearby, and the shockwave would tear steel like paper. Brace positions, WWII commanded." His voice steady though his heartbeat raced. He grabbed the rail beside him. Brant covered the GHG unit with his body instinctively. Sailors tightened belts, bit down on cloth, clung to whatever they could find. Then, a series of release clanks echoed faintly from above. 5 seconds, 10 seconds, 20. The ocean erupted. The first blast hit to port, shaking the submarine violently. Light bulbs flickered. Dust fell from pipes. Metal snapped somewhere forward. Another blast. Closer. Much closer. Brant shouted over the noise. "Bulkhead, holding." For now. A third explosion slammed the hull from below, throwing 2 sailors off their feet. Heinz listened through chaos and heard the worst sound of all a destroyer accelerating. "They're coming back around!" He yelled. The corridor of steel and silence had become a killing ground, and the escorts had just begun their attack. The lights flickered again, weaker this time, as the U-223 steadied itself after the last blast. The steel hull moaned a long, trembling sound that made every man freeze. At 90 meters below the surface, those sounds were not simply noise. They were warnings. The ocean was reminding them that pressure alone could finish what the depth charges had started. Capid, Lieutenant Karl Wächter gripped the chart table until his knuckles turned white. The worst thing he could do now was panic. The second worst was move. The escorts above were resetting their formation. In the listening room, Oberfunkmott Heinz Behrens pressed his headphones tighter. Through the ringing in his ears, he identified the destroyer's approach. Its propellers churned with an aggression he had learned to fear. "They're accelerating again," he whispered, "likely beginning a creeping attack." That tactic, newly perfected by British escorts, was designed to kill U-boats slowly. One ship maintained sonar contact at low speed, while another crept behind and dropped charges based on the first vessel's bearings. It was nearly impossible to evade. Heinz listened harder. The ASDIC pings were slower, colder, more methodical. The escorts were no longer guessing. They were stalking. In the forward compartment, Matrosenschreiter Lucas Hartmann knelt beside a leaking pipe that had begun to sweat under pressure. He wrapped a strip of rubber around it, tightening it with trembling fingers. The air smelled of metal and fear. "Hold. Just hold," he muttered, as much to himself as to the submarine. Back in the control room, Leutnant Branch checked the hull integrity gauges. A thin line of moisture trickled from a seam near the electrical cabineta leak beginning under pressure. He pointed to it, his voice low but urgent. "If we go deeper, this spreads. If we go up, they'll hear the ballast." A perfect trap. Depth meant collapse. Surface meant death. Wächter nodded grimly. "Then we stay here." Silence followed, not the safe silence of hiding but the suffocating silence of waiting for the next blow. Then it came. A fresh Aztec ping hit the hull directly. Another. The pattern was too precise. Heinz lowered the headphones, eyes hollow. "They have us." The destroyer passed overhead. The sound was unmistakable, the heavy churn of 4 massive propellers. Heinz could practically feel the shadow above them. Then, metallic clanks. The release hooks, depth charges. Those synths of TEM falling like a rain of iron. Wächter braced himself against the bulkhead. He didn't bother issuing the order. The men already knew to hold on. 15 seconds. 10. 5. The sea exploded. A blast rocked the stern, smashing equipment from the racks. Another shook the bow so violently that one of the forward torpedoes shifted in its cradle. Brandt shouted, "Secure that tube, now." Sailors fought to restrain the heavy weapon as more explosions hammered the hull. A charge detonated so close to the port side that the entire submarine rolled. The lights went out completely, plunging the U-223 into blackness. Screams mixed with a groan of bending metal. Something burst a pipe, or a valve sending a fine spray of freezing seawater into the control room. Brandt switched on an emergency lamp, its dim orange glow cutting through the darkness, just enough to reveal the terror on the men's faces. "Bulkheads are holding," he said, gasping. "Barely." Then Heinz spoke again, his voice shaking not from fear but from the knowledge of what came next. "They're turning for another run." Above them, the destroyer's engines roared as it prepared a fresh pattern. In that moment, Wächter understood fully. This wasn't a hunt. It was an execution. Unless he found a way to outthink the hunters, and fast, the U-223 would never see daylight again. The control room felt like a coffin suspended in black water. Every man aboard the U-223 knew that the next depth charge run could be the one that crushed them. Capit and Lieutenant Karl Wächter stood completely still, not out of fear, but because thinking required silence, absolute silence. His mind replayed every tactic he'd learned, every patrol he had survived, and every report from other U-boats lost in the Atlantic. The escorts above were performing a textbook creeping attack, a method designed to eliminate any chance of escape. But Wächter also knew something. Something the British didn't expect a U-boat commander to use so boldly in this moment. They still had one weapon left. The ocean itself. "Brandt," Wächter whispered, leaning toward the engineer. "Can we risk a downward drift using trim adjustments only?" Brandt hesitated. "No engines? No pumps. Nothing that makes noise." Brandt exhaled slowly. "Possible, but we'll sink like a stone. If we miscalculate, we won't," Wächter said. The decision was madness. Dangerous. Borderline suicidal. But depth charges were calibrated to expected depths. If the U-223 broke those expectations without making sound, the pattern above might explode harmlessly in empty water. Brandt relayed the instructions quietly. Sailors moved with delicate precision, adjusting trim tanks by hand, releasing tiny amounts of compressed air, shifting weight just enough to change the submarine's buoyancy without producing a mechanical sound. It was underwater, dangerous, imperfect, and nearly impossible under pressure. Slowly, the U-223 began to sink. At 95 meters, the hull groaned. At 100, the sound grew sharper, tighter. At 110, a bolt shot loose from a bulkhead, clattering onto the floor. Hartmann grabbed it immediately, clutching it to his chest as if the noise itself could kill them. In the listening compartment, Oberfunkmott Heinz Behrens heard the destroyer turning for another run. The ASDIC pings were crisper, now focused, confident. The escorts believed they knew exactly where the submarine was, because they did know, just not where it was now. "Hold steady," Wächter ordered, though his voice was barely more than a breath. No reactions, no movement. The next barrage began. Depth charges dropped in a perfect line, detonating at 90 meters where the U-223 had been minutes earlier. The explosions boomed through the water, but they were far enough away to avoid catastrophic damage. Still, the shock waves rattled equipment and shook nerves. Heinz removed one headphone slightly, listening intently. "They think we're higher," he whispered. "Their operator corrected based on our previous depth. They're sure they have us pinned." Wächter allowed himself a single, slow inhale. The escorts were hunting ghosts. But danger was far from over. Brandt suddenly appeared with a grim expression. "Capit. Ene. The lower ballast tank valve is showing pressure variation. If it fails, we'll correct it later," Wächter said. "Quiet for now." The destroyer passed overhead again, slower this time, listening, searching, feeling for vibrations. Then the ASDIC pings shifted direction away. Not toward, they're sweeping forward, Heinz whispered. They've lost us. Wächter closed his eyes for half a second. Not relief, just calculation. Good. We don't surface. Not yet. We drift. We wait. Minutes passed long, agonizing minutes when no one dared to breathe loudly. Then Heinz frowned. Capitan, something else. Faint screws. Multiple. Wächter turned sharply. More escorts. Heinz shook his head. No, sir. Merchant ships? Brandt's eyes widened. The convoy. Wächter finished the sentence in a whisper. It's passing right over us. For the first time since the attack began, the ocean itself was about to protect the U-2-3. The vast convoy diazons of shipswood masked their signature, clutter sonar, and drown out their presence with a forest of propellers. But it also meant something else. Wächter damaged, exhausted, and now trapped beneath the largest moving wall of steel on Earth. Escape would require perfect timing. One misstep, and the U-223 would be crushed under the convoy it came to hunt. The sound of the convoy passing overhead was unlike anything the men of the U-223 had ever heard. It wasn't noise, it was a moving continent. Layers upon layers of propellers churned the water, each vibration overlapping until the ocean felt alive with metallic thunder. At 110 meters below, the submarine trembled as if caught beneath a stampede. Kapitän Collier. Wächter stood motionless in the dim glow of the emergency bulbs, listening not with his ears, but with his entire body. Every frequency, every tremor, every distant thrum mattered now. The escorts had lost contact, but the convoy itself had become a barrier so massive that any movement risked catastrophe. In the listening room, Oberfunkmott Heinz Behrens fought to filter through the chaos. His headphones buzzed with overlapping screw-stankers, freighters, troopships, trawlers forming an impenetrable forest of sound. I can't isolate anything, he whispered. It's all merging. For the first time on this patrol, Heinz felt blind. The GHG, which had given the U-2-3 its advantage, was overwhelmed by the sheer density of acoustic signatures. It was like trying to count the voices in a stadium roar. Leitender engineer Otto Brandt crouched beside the ballast control valves, watching the gauges tremble with pressure. The submarine had absorbed damage deeper in the hull than he initially thought. A hairline fracture in the portside ballast line now seeped salt water in thin pulses. Capitan, he said quietly, we can hold depth, but correcting buoyancy will make noise. Everything will WWII, Churn nodded. Every decision carried risk. Rising would be suicide. Diving much deeper risked collapse. Remaining still meant trusting the convoy to pass without incident. The hull groaned again sharp, metallic. Lucas Hartmann flinched. The sound was from above this time. Something massive crossed directly overhead, causing the submarine's lighting to flicker. That's a tanker, Brandt murmured. 6, maybe 7,000 tons. The weight of it, even far above, felt like a hand pressing the submarine downward. For 30 agonizing minutes, the U-223 remained trapped under the convoy's center. Heinz tried desperately to identify escort patterns, but the overlapping propellers masked everything except the closest threats. When a merchant ship passed directly above, the hydrophones whined so loudly he had to pull the headphones off. We're invisible for now, Heinz said, catching his breath. But so are they. Wächter stared at the chart. The convoy route would soon enter deeper waters. That could help, if they held steady, perfectly steady. The shifting ocean layers might mask them further. We wait, he said. We listen, and when the convoy thins, we rise slowly. Minutes stretched into an hour. Finally, the acoustic storm began to thin. The massive tankers passed. Then the troopship, the steady churn of another line of freighters faded. The final merchantman crossed with a long reluctant Then silence returned, thick and almost holy after the chaos. But Heinz's relief vanished in an instant. He froze, tilted his head, listened. No roar now. Only one sound. A sharp, deliberate pattern. "Escort astern," he whispered. "Single ship. Slow? Very slow." Brandt tensed, creeping search mode again. Heinz nodded. "Yes, but not like before. This one's different. It's matching our position, not the convoys." Wächter approached the listening station. "Distance?" Heinz swallowed. "Close." "Too close. They didn't lose us completely. He waited. A realization settled over the control room like a cold fog. The convoy was never the real shield. It had been bait. Masking, waiting, and now, one escort, likely a destroyer or advanced corvette, was performing a silent, methodical hunt. No depth charges yet. No sonar sweep, just listening. Listening for anything, a creak, a shift, a breath. The U-223 hung in the water like prey, holding still as a predator sniffed at the shadows. Wächter's voice came as a whisper meant only for his officers. "They know we're down here. And more chilling still, they're waiting for us to make the first mistake." The U-223 hovered in the cold depths like a wounded animal, silent, battered, and painfully aware that a single escort ship lingered above, patiently waiting in the dark. Kapit and Lieutenant Karl Wächter felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders in a way he had never experienced. 9 hours of evasion had pushed the submarine to its limits. Systems were failing. Air was thinning. Pressure gauges trembled dangerously close to their red marks. The question was no longer how to strike the convoy. It was whether they could escape the ocean alive. The destroyer above moved with a terrifying grace. It wasn't charging. It wasn't dropping depth charges. It was listening, studying the water, searching for the faintest hint of mechanical life. A predator that had learned restraint. In the listening room, Oberfunkmott Heinz, Behrens tried to track its pattern. It's circling. "Slowly," he whispered. "It's using passive listening. They're not pinging. They don't want to spook us." "Clever," Brandt muttered. "They're waiting for a mistake." Wächter looked at the men around him, exhausted, pale, drenched in sweat and seawater. They had reached a point where even breathing felt dangerous. But there was one truth he could not ignore. Staying at 110 meters much longer risked structural failure. The submarine wasn't built for this kind of prolonged pressure. He turned to Leitendor, Engineer Otto Brandt. "We need to rise, not to periscope depth, just enough to ease the hull." Brandt hesitated. "We'll need ballast adjustments, and that means noise." "I know," Wächter said. Silence followed, long, heavy, suffocating. Finally, Wächter gave the order. "Prepare for controlled ascent." The crew moved with the precision of men who understood that every breath could be their last. They adjusted trim tanks by the smallest margins possible. No pumps, no engines, only air displacement and gravity. The U-223 responded sluggishly at first, then began a slow, agonizing climb through the crushing darkness. At 100 meters, the hull relaxed slightly. At 95 meters, a groan of metal echoed through the control room. The noise traveled through the water like a beacon. Heinz stiffened. The destroyer heard that ASDIC pings erupted immediately overhead shop. Violent, unmistakable. The predator had sensed movement. "Breeze!" Wächter shouted. A single depth charge pattern detonated 30 meters above their previous depth, far enough to avoid catastrophic damage, but close enough to send a wave of terror through the crew. Dust fell. Pipes shook. A valve burst in the aft compartment, spraying seawater like a cold, punishing rain. Yet Wächter did not stop the ascent. He couldn't. At 80 meters, the pinging lessened. The escort had lost contact momentarily. At 70 meters, Brandt inspected the ballast valves again. "We can't stay submerged much longer," he whispered. "Batteries are nearly gone. Core levels rising. WWII. Churn nodded. The choice was now brutal, but simple. Either surface and risk being attacked, or sink slowly into the Atlantic. The captain closed his eyes for a moment on lee, then prepare for emergency surface. The order swept through the submarine like electricity. Men raced to stations, levers locked into place. Compressed air hissed into ballast tanks, the first loud mechanical sound the U-2-3 had made in hours. The destroyer reacted, instantly accelerating, closing distance. Surface. 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 Cater. Sounded. The U-223 shot upward through the water column, breaking through the fog-covered surface with a violent splash. The deck bursts into open air cold, wet, and blinding. Searchlights immediately snapped toward them. Machine guns roared from the escort, but Wächter was already shouting. "Crash! Dive!" The hull angled downward again before enemy fire could find its mark. The U-223 slipped beneath the surface in seconds, vanishing into the fog-drenched water as the destroyer's searchlights swept wildly across empty waves. At 30 meters below, the submarine leveled off. Heinz listened. Brandt checked pressure. The crew waited, hearts pounding, lungs burning. The destroyer circled, then drifted away. Minutes passed. And then silence. Real silence. For the first time in 2 days, Wächter allowed himself to breathe fully. The U-223 was alive. Damaged. Exhausted. But alive. No torpedoes fired, no ship sunk, no victory claimed. Yet every man aboard understood the truth. Survival in the Battle of the Atlantic was its own kind of victory. And on that night, deep beneath the frozen waves, the U-223 had earned it.